Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is Monday, March 2nd, 2026, and I'm the host of the show, Dr. Cara Santa Maria. And as always, before we dive into this week's episode, I want to thank those of you who make Talk Nerdy possible. Remember, this show is and will always be 100% free to download. And the way that we keep this show going week after week is by relying on the support of listeners just like you. If you'd like to pledge your support on an episodic basis, all you've got to do is visit patreon.com, that's patreon.com/talknerdy to learn more. This week's top patrons include Chuck Blell, David J.E. Smith, Daniel Lang, Mary Neva, David Compton, Brian Holden, Gabo J., Ulrika Hagman, Pasquale Gelati, Joe Wilkinson, and so many more. Thank you all so much from the bottom of my heart. All right, let's get into it. This week, I had the opportunity to chat with Dr. Daphne O. Martschenko. She's an assistant professor at the Stanford Center for Biomedical Ethics. And her research focuses on novel ways to examine and enhance the ethical and socially responsible conduct, translation, and interpretation of human genetic research. She's here today to talk about a new book that she co-authored with her friend and colleague Sam Trejo, a sociologist at Princeton. The book is called What We Inherit: How New Technologies and Old Myths Are Shaping Our Genomic Future. So without any further ado, here she is, Dr. Daphne O. Martschenko. Well, Daphne, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
I'm excited to talk about your new book that you co-authored with Sam Trejo, What We Inherit: How New Technologies and Old Myths Are Shaping Our Genomic Future. But of course, before we even dive into the book itself, I'd love to learn a little bit more about you and about your scholarship. So you're a bioethicist, and Trejo, your co-author, is a sociologist. So bioethics is a really interesting field because it's, I mean, at least from what I understand, it requires an inordinate amount of multidisciplinary thought. So I'm curious, what did you study to get to where you are now?
Yes, I definitely did not have a linear path in any way. So my undergrad degrees were in medical anthropology and Slavic languages and literatures.
Okay.
While I was an undergrad, I started working for an education nonprofit based out of Oakland, California. So I did my undergrad at Stanford, which is where I ultimately returned to be an assistant professor. But when I was an undergrad, I started working at this education nonprofit and became really interested and passionate about educational equity, and was most of the way through undergrad at that point and realized that I wanted to get additional education on education. And so I went to the University of Cambridge in the United Kingdom to do a master's in politics, development, and democratic education, and ultimately decided to stay for a PhD in education. And after my PhD, I decided to leave academia just for a little bit because I had always thought that academia was not a career path for me. And by the end of my PhD, I felt a little pull towards trying to pursue a career in academia. But I had just been so certain when I started my PhD that I wasn't going to go that route that I felt that I should test out a non-academic career path just to see if there was any call to it that remained. So I went to the University of Chicago, but I worked at a nonprofit out of the University of Chicago. So I wasn't doing academic research. I was working with local governments and other nonprofits to try and bring some of the academic research tools to these more real world applications. I really enjoyed that work, But I found that in my free time, I was trying to publish papers from my PhD data. And I'll talk a little bit about what I did for my PhD because it is ultimately what led me to bioethics.
Okay.
So even though my PhD is in education, I really had a deep interest in this emerging area of genetic research that I kind of accidentally discovered. The field is called social and behavioral genomics. The researchers who are in this field, they're studying whether and how DNA differences between individuals correspond to differences in behaviors like intelligence and social outcomes like educational attainment or income. And it's a very polarizing and controversial field, in part because there's a very long and troubling history of using genetic claims regarding human difference to legitimize social inequalities, to do things like involuntarily sterilize people. And so when I happened upon this book in the library at Cambridge that was titled G is for Genes, I had so many questions about how this area of research, and in particular how genetic research on education-related behaviors and outcomes might shape teacher perceptions of student ability and student achievement, particularly in contexts like the United States, where we have racial and socioeconomic disparities in educational outcomes, and where we know that teacher perceptions of student ability and student achievement have an impact on those students' progressions into higher education, their perceptions of themselves in terms of their self-confidence, their beliefs about their own academic potential. And we also have this history of conflating race with biology, like inappropriately positioning race as this biological category. And so I happened upon this book when I was doing my master's and decided that I wanted to do a PhD understanding how this area of science might impact teachers' perceptions of student ability and achievement, and what the social and ethical implications of this area might be. And so those were, I was taking the interview data that I had done with teachers and with scientists who were doing these genomic studies, and I was trying to publish papers on it while I was working at this nonprofit on the side, and realized I think I'm still really, really interested in thinking about the ethics of this area of scientific research. So that ultimately led me back to Stanford, where I did a postdoc at the Center for Biomedical Ethics. And then I got a faculty position at the center. So I have been in and out of Stanford for a number of years now, but I have done a lot of interdisciplinary kinds of focuses, different degrees and different subjects. And ultimately, I feel really at home in bioethics because it is a field rather than a discipline. People are coming to it from all kinds of different backgrounds. My colleagues here have training in philosophy and anthropology and pharmacology and genetics. It just brings together people from all different kinds of intellectual camps. And I really appreciate the richness that comes from being able to have those conversations as part of my everyday work.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like sort of throughout your academic journey, you came to find an area that spoke to you personally, professionally, academically, intellectually, ideologically. I'm curious, you mentioned that your undergraduate degree was in anthropology and Slavic languages, and reading about you a little bit. So you lived in Ukraine and Russia when you were young. Is that what kind of got you to that area of interest in European languages? Was because of your kind of ethnic heritage, or is it because you were exposed to them when you were so young?
Both. So I love languages in general. I took Arabic when I was in college in addition to studying Russian and Russian literature. And my father has Ukrainian heritage. And
Mm-hmm.
I spent a lot of my childhood growing up and living in different countries in Eastern Europe because my father worked for the State Department. And as a native Russian speaker, he was placed in countries where that language is spoken. And so it's a combination of my experiences growing up and my heritage, and also my love for languages generally, that led to studying that. I mean, the kind of funny thing about that is I hadn't planned to major in Slavic studies. And I actually went in, I remember, to declare the minor. And I remember the professor that I was meeting with said, well, actually, if you take just a couple more classes, you'd get the major, you'd meet the major criteria. So I didn't go in expressly trying to major in it. I really was there because I, wanted to develop the language skills, but it ended up that I got a major out of it as well.
That's crazy. So how many languages do you speak?
Well, nowadays, I think I can only really speak English. My Russian is pretty rusty, and my husband's German, so I'm been trying to learn German over the last 10 years. But I would say that is I haven't made as much progress as I would have liked. I'd say so. Still learning. And my Arabic, I mean, I took it through undergrad, but I haven't had the opportunity to keep up with it since. So I can say a couple of things.
I'm curious. Obviously, this is what I'm getting from your Wikipedia page. So correct anything that might be incorrect, but also I'd love to dig deeper, to the extent that you're comfortable. But so you mentioned that your father was in the Foreign Service, and so you were in these countries. He was assigned in countries where he could use those language skills that he had. Your mother is originally from Nigeria, so how did they meet?
Yeah, they met in Nigeria. My dad was stationed at the U.S. Embassy in Nigeria, and my mom was working as a translator and cultural guide for the embassy. And that's how they met. And it's wild to me to think that my mom went from living in Nigeria to living in Kyrgyzstan shortly after the fall of the Soviet Union.
Yeah, wow.
A country where she didn't speak the language, where she didn't know anybody. It boggles my mind how the strength that must have been required to make a transition like that.
Absolutely. And I mean, it's fascinating thinking about these very kind of personal experiences of all of our families that shape who we are, and sort of superimposing them, or maybe putting them in parallel with these academic areas of interest that you have. I mean, talk about, you mentioned before the fraught history of what we think of. I mean, I'm a psychologist, right? So a lot of the very subject matter that you mentioned, which is sort of intelligence testing and utilizing different statistical tools. Most of these, I was just talking about this on another show I was working on. Most of these tools it wasn't a bug, it was an actual feature. Like the men who developed a lot of tools like regression, for example, were intentionally trying to prove superiority of the white race. Like there was deep eugenicist and deep racial intentionality in early psychology, in early intelligence testing research. And so it's fascinating to me, and I'm just excited to dig really deep into both the personal and professional when it comes to things like culture, when it comes to, race, which is this social construct, but of course, ethnicity and genealogy, which is complex and deep. And you are definitely somebody who has an interesting ethnic background as well.
Yeah, and I think that is something that I bring into the book in trying to demonstrate just the fluidity around what race is and how it is a social process that is tied to power. Bringing in, examples from my own life in terms of how I've been treated differently in different scenarios, depending on, if I'm with my white father alone, or I'm with both my parents together, or I'm just with my Black mother. And also how, in different environments, the kind of racial category that's been affixed to me has also changed. So I think bringing my own experiences to the table was one way to try and demonstrate the fluidity around race and the social processes that are involved in the construction of race.
Yeah. I mean, in writing the book, do you feel that your sort of identification or the personal labels that you take on have changed as a function of the book? Or do you feel like the book really was kind of a look back and a reflection on what you had experienced and learned academically too, up till the point of writing it?
I think it was a look back and a reflection. And actually, before Sam and I started officially writing the book, we'd agreed that we were going to write a book together, and we, were putting together an outline of what it might look like. But we started doing these exercises where we assigned ourselves a question each week to take some time to write up an answer to, or kind of reflection, almost like a diary entry or journal entry. And one of them was about race and ancestry and kind of our own personal experiences with race and how we're thinking about it and how it's shaped it. And so that actually is something that we returned to when we were writing our chapter on race and ancestry, chapter 3. But yeah, it was a interesting series of exercises that we did prior to actually getting started on writing the book itself, just to start developing a better understanding of the other person.
And I think that kind of sociologic practice, reflexive practice, is so important. I did my dissertation in clinical psychology. I did a dissertation that was qualitative in nature, and prior to my PhD in clinical psychology, I had worked in neurobiology, and I didn't even know what qualitative research was. I had no idea that not only should there be reflexive practice when one is digging deep into these constructs, but it actually, I think bolsters the scholarship quite a bit. And so I love hearing about I guess these different fields interweaving in such a way, and sort of maybe shaking the shoulders a bit of scientists who come from, the biological sciences, or who come from even chemistry and physics, who sometimes I think personally look down on, or maybe just don't fully understand the importance and the necessity, really, of these kind of sociologic lenses with which we have to look at science.
Yeah, Sam and I have talked about that a lot through the process of writing the book, because, he is a quantitative sociologist. He leverages genetic data in the work that he does. He uses genetic data to try and answer questions that sociologists tend to answer. So he's in that, interesting kind of interdisciplinary space, but he very much comes from a camp that privileges, quantitative methods, these causal kind of interpretations. And I'm coming from an orientation where, historically I've done more qualitative kind of work, and people in bioethics often are asking these very large kind of existential questions that can't be answered with a randomized control trial or some neatly designed and packaged social experiment. And so Sam and I spent time talking about the fact that these different kinds of questions that these different research communities are asking are both valuable, but there can be this perception from either of each camp, that the other side is, less rigorous or not taking account of the bigger picture and missing important contextual factors. And one of the reasons why we came together to write our book is because even though we were coming from these different academic communities and also had different viewpoints on some of the risks and benefits of doing social and behavioral genomic research. We call it social genomics in the book. Even though we were coming from these different camps, we both shared a disillusionment with how bitter the debate had become within the academic community and how black and white people were making things seem. And that while folks were entrenched in their respective camps, industry were taking the data and running away with it, coming out with these applications that are premature and that, we felt we needed to be thinking more carefully about. I think one of our goals in writing this book is to really challenge that kind of black and white distinction, to really challenge the pull to try and make something that's very complex seem very simple. I think we see ourselves as really living in that gray area and bringing that gray area to folks, and hopefully also getting our respective communities to come to a single piece and come away from it better understanding the nature of the disagreements that people may have around whether to do genomic work on social behavioral traits, what the harms might be, what the potential benefits might be. Yeah.
Yeah, I have to admit, I think that's partially why I was so interested in having this conversation with you today, is because I want to take an honest look in the mirror for myself as a thinker, as an academic, and as a practitioner, right? Because I actually do see patients. I think I worry, maybe, as we've been talking, that I am in one of those more entrenched camps. And I think a lot of that had to do with the sort of awakening that I had as I got deeper into my scholarship about a lot of the historical harms of my very field of inquiry, and about sort of the American eugenics story and how close it was to science and scientific skepticism. Like, I've been an activist in the scientific skeptic movement for a really long time. I'm very pro evidence-based thinking. But I'm also somebody who knows that unfettered access to data or unfettered inquiry just for the sake of inquiry, it's never pure, right? People are people, and people have biases and they have intentions. And history has shown time and time again that not just with people of color, but like women and femme presenting individuals especially, that there has just been a long bias in science, especially in biology, to try and prove, I guess, the power structures that are, to try and prove that there's some form of natural order. They are this way because they should be this way, because by definition, right, white men have superior intellect or strength or whatever the hell it might be. So I would love to get deep right here at the beginning with, like, what's the difference between this field of social and behavioral genomics and what we think of as sort of just like historical genetics? Because as we know, like, I think there's this really telling photograph. I'm not sure if you've ever seen it. In some library somewhere where somebody took a picture. I think it's the Annals of Human Genetics. I think that's what the journal was called. And there's literally a date in time where it switches over from being called the Annals of Eugenics to the Annals of Human Genetics, because they were sort of one and the same historically from an academic perspective.
So one of the things that we map out in the book is the history behind the modern field of social genomics. And we talk about figures like Francis Galton, who's widely considered to be a founding figure of eugenics, founding figure of the field of behavior genetics, which is a kind of precursor to social genomics, and also was a pioneer in statistics.
Yeah.
And I think as another component to the work that I do, I interview scientists, and one of the ways that the way that Sam and I actually came to meet each other was because I had reached out to his PhD advisor to ask if his PhD advisor would talk to me as part of my dissertation, my own PhD. He was doing work around the genetics of educational attainment, and I was very interested in talking to researchers who were doing those kinds of studies to understand their motivations for doing it, their views on the risks and benefits of that kind of research. And it was through a kind of series of conversations that I had with Sam's PhD advisor that I then got introduced to Sam. So I know that, in my experiences in talking to some of the scientists who are doing this work about why they're doing it, that for some of them, that historical memory, knowing that Francis Galton was not just this pioneer in statistical approaches, but also was central to the eugenics movement in the United Kingdom and a huge source of inspiration for the eugenics movement in the United States. That historical memory was something that some of them came to only recently, later on in their careers. And so I think it's very important to bring that historical memory to work that gets done today. That's one of the things that I prioritize in the work that I do, is bringing in that social context, that historical context, to help contextualize, to help us make sense of what's happening in the world today. So yeah, I think history is super, super important. And one of the core messages of the book is we're not only trying to unpack what is DNA and what is biological inheritance, but also to unpack these myths about DNA that are also inherited socially, that come from our eugenic past, that get passed down culturally. And we're trying to emphasize that there are these dual inheritance processes. It's not just biological inheritance that people are thinking about or should think about when they're doing genomic work, but also think about the social inheritance, the kind of conceptual acid that are these myths about DNA. And in the book, we focus on two myths in particular that we set out to debunk and challenge. One of them is called the destiny myth. So, the false belief that genes are immutable, that they are destiny, that there's always this very clear, linear, simple line from A to B, from a DNA variant and an outcome. Right. Like I said before, I think we really wanted to emphasize the gray area and live in the gray area and get comfortable with being in the gray area. And so, part of that involves debunking these myths and, showing that when a genetic researcher says something like the genetic effects on whatever, educational attainment, because that's one of the traits that social behavioral genomics researchers focus on a lot. It's also very controversial. We kind of unpack that it doesn't really mean genetic effects. There's this really complex interplay with the environment and DNA, and these tools that the researchers are using are functioning as a black box predictor. And, some people feel that given some of the risks that come from doing this research, we should have a lower tolerance for rolling out and using these kinds of predictors where we don't understand, why they're predicting. There's no causal mechanism that's been identified. It's a bit of a tangent, but what I'm trying to say here is, we set out to debunk the destiny myth. We also set out to debunk the race myth, the false belief that there are these discrete, non-overlapping racial groups, and those groups are biologically distinct. And because of those biological differences, there are also differences in terms of life outcomes and behaviors. So that's another thing that we set out to disrupt. But we show kind of the history of how these myths came to be in the world and the life that they take on today, not just how they first appeared in our society.
Mm-hmm. And so you mentioned this sort of gray area, and obviously debunking these two myths is central to being able to exist in this gray area of the complex interplay of variables that, I don't even like using the word determine, but the complex interplay of variables that collectively influence, behavior, for example, or certain states or traits, and this idea of race, right? Not being a biological construct, but definitely being like a socio-political construct. You sort of mentioned previously that within academic circles, there do tend to be some polarizations. And I've recognized this both in podcasting, also in my academic work, but heavily when I talk about these topics in podcasting, I get feedback from listeners. And very often they're academics themselves who listen to the show. And I do tend to see these two camps. I tend to see the sort of like, throw all of it out with the bathwater because it's so fraught and there's so much harm that's been perpetuated or perpetrated through the use of these sort of genetic claims and intentionally eugenic arguments. Why even bother talking about sort of the biological basis of these things when we can't even fully determine what is biology versus, what is nature versus nurture. And then you see the other side where people, I don't even know why these people still exist, but where they're like deeply defending, like, no, Galton had some good ideas and you can't judge him because of his, eugenicist past, and it really wasn't as bad as people make it out to be, and he was a man of his time. You hear that one a lot too, right? Like, well, these were just, this was a la mode, so we can't really blame these people for thinking that way because that was kind of the cultural zeitgeist at the time. That one, I don't think we need to spend as much time on. I think that there are just people who are entrenched and don't want to admit that the field that they work in has a racist past. And I think a lot of times people have a hard time recognizing their own racial identity kind of development. I think the other side, I'm curious what your positioning is towards individuals who say, like, why are you even doing this work?
Yeah.
Like, why is it important for you to hold on to arguments around social and behavioral genomics? Why not just focus on the non sort of biologic components, which appear to have to be responsible for a lot more variance in outward behavior?
I get that question a lot. And my response is there's this long history of claims regarding genetic difference being used for social harm. And I don't see how we can challenge or work to reduce the prevalence of those beliefs if we don't engage with the science that gets utilized incorrectly often to make those kinds of claims. So, one of our chapters talks about how genomic studies get taken up by people who have racially motivated intentions. So, for instance, we talk about the Buffalo shooter who killed 10 Black Americans in a supermarket in May of 2022, and his manifesto citing a number of genomic studies as alleged evidence of the biological superiority of white people over Black people. I feel like I have a duty and a responsibility to not only challenge those misuses of genomic work, but also to try and see if we can identify novel approaches to doing the work in a responsible manner. I don't know, maybe some people would say it's the pessimist in me, or other people would say it's the optimist in me. But on the one hand, I don't see a world where this research stops getting done.
Right.
And so therefore, I feel like it's important that if it is going to be done, there are people who are calling out its limitations. There are people who are thinking about making sure that it's being conducted and translated in a responsible way that, as best as possible, is minimizing the potential risks. And some people might think that I'm naive for trying to do that work, that it's a losing battle. But I think that in some ways is a kind of determinism that maybe I see shared by folks across the aisle in some instances. So let me explain what I mean. Sometimes when I talk to scientists around the risks of the work that they're doing, I get a response like, well, the Buffalo shooter would have done what he did regardless of whether or not I do the genomic studies that I'm doing. Kind of, there will always be bad apples who are going to do what they're going to do regardless of, what I do. And sometimes when people make that argument, it ends up functioning as a way to remove responsibility to do something. It kind of ends up being a zero-sum game. And I guess I kind of see a similarity between the sentiment that someone should not be even giving attention to this research because of the risks that it entails. Because like I said, the work is going to get done regardless of whether or not I decide to give it the time of day or not. And it feels to me like it's more responsible to engage with it and try to focus on risk reduction and try and understand, why people are doing this work and what they think the risks of it are, than do nothing. I don't know if that makes sense.
No, it made perfect sense, and I can't help but identify a parallel in my own mind, which is kind of like weirdly coincidental because your father, as you mentioned, was in the Foreign Service. I have a friend who's in the Foreign Service, and I remember asking during this administration, like, why are you staying during all the different rifts and the rounds of like massive layoffs and all of the different mandates that were sort of ideologically distinct from their intention in doing this kind of work. I remember asking, like, why are you staying? And they said, like, because we need people like me to do this work too. Like, if I leave and people like me leave, then the only people doing the work right now in the State Department are the people with the same viewpoints as the current administration. And so it's interesting. I see almost a similar parallel there, that you can affect a lot more change from inside the system. But I wonder, do you feel that it requires a sort of excising of historical wrongs from the system? A sort of like you mentioned, absolute debunking of, for example, the misguided view, the pseudoscience, basically, that race is a biological construct. Do you feel like we need to go in and systematically retract and debunk like a bunch of papers that historically were written within the field?
I also think education is a massive element of this. And I'm not just saying that because, that's where I got my grad training in, but there's really interesting and I think meaningful work that was being done. Unfortunately, with the current climate, some of those grant studies were not, funding was cut off, but work trying to change how high school biology curriculum is taught, to move away from the Gregor Mendel and his pea pods type of approach to teaching about genetics that has shown that if we teach about genetics in a way that, again, leans into the gray area, that shows that things are more complex, that it's not as simple as X gene leads to Y outcome, that kind of nuanced education can reduce belief in things like the destiny myth and the race myth. So I think there's also this education component that comes even before we think about researchers at academic institutions doing their work and publishing their studies.
Right. Sort of starting with much younger people who are just being exposed to these ways of thinking.
Right. But like I said, in some of the interviews that I do with scientists about the work that they do and their kind of views on it and the downstream implications of it, the risks and benefits, for some of them, it's a relatively new development in terms of thinking about the history behind the field. Like that wasn't part of their training when they were going through graduate school, and they're kind of now learning about some of that troubling history. And so I think it's not just in, high school or K-12 education. It's also the education that researchers undergo in grad school environments. And I think part of that means, being able to look at studies that have been published in the past and interrogate and debunk and challenge them. I think that is a great, it's a great way for people to learn, is to look at what has been done in the past and what is wrong with it, and how can we really understand not only what is scientifically bad or invalid about what's been done, but also what were the social consequences of that study getting done.
Yeah. So much. I mean, I really owe a lot to my graduate psychology education. I took some, anybody who studies psychology takes history and systems courses where you learn about, how do we know what we know, and why are the schools of thought as they are now. People learn about Freud and stuff. Nobody's actually practicing Freudian psychology now, but people learn about what that looked like. And what I was lucky enough to be exposed to were primary sources. And the thing is, when you read Darwin and you read Freud and you read Galton's own words, you're like, ooh, like as you're actually digging deep into their writing, and not just a review of their writing or a textbook summarizing their writing and, kind of conveniently sanitizing it. But when you read the words that these people wrote, you cannot help but start to recognize intentionality, bias, kind of cultural pressures. And it's tough, It's like I'm an existential psychologist. I read a lot of Heidegger. I've read a lot of existential philosophy. I've read, different writers who had pretty horrific social views, and you cannot extricate them from the good in their writing. You have to take the good with the bad and try to make sense of it, as you mentioned, in that gray. But I don't think we do enough reading of primary sources in our academic systems.
There's a course that some PhD students at Stanford in the genetics department put together a few years ago that was motivated by the feeling among those trainees that they weren't receiving sufficient ethics education that was specific to genetics. And as part of that course, the reason I bring it up is that as part of that course, they go to the archives at Stanford and look at some of those primary source materials from leaders in the eugenics movement, many of whom had strong ties to Stanford, to better understand how that history continues to inform the work that they are now getting training in and learning how to do themselves. And I feel super hopeful in seeing those examples of students wanting to engage with that history and to get that deeper understanding of the ethical and social implications of their work.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I also can't help but think about, and I've talked about this on the show before, the book by Beverly Tatum called "Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria?" And there's a sort of analogy, I guess, a metaphor that she uses that I bring up again and again, which is the moving sidewalk, like the people mover, at the airport. And she says, anti-racist activism, and here we could even say sort of critical review or critical thinking about these fields of inquiry are similar to turning around and walking against the moving sidewalk. That like many researchers, they may not be, so she says like white supremacists, right? Like, and this is obviously the scaffolding that she's using, but like white supremacists, you could sort of imagine are walking fast on the moving sidewalk. So they are both pushing forward, but they're also using the built-in system to advantage them to push forward. And then like anti-racist, activists are turning around and walking faster than the moving sidewalk is pulling them. But most people are just standing there and they think that they're not perpetuating the problem, but actually they're being carried by sort of the momentum of history and of these systems. And it sounds like some of those people that you interviewed and you said, and they said, well, he was going to go out and do the shooting regardless of my research. They're kind of just standing on the moving sidewalk.
And look, I understand that it can be very overwhelming to take a look at something as horrific as the Buffalo shooting and acknowledge or have to acknowledge that maybe work you had done influenced that person's opinions or beliefs in some way.
Right.
I get that. I also understand that, it's really hard to think practically about how to translate social responsibility into action. So, there's academic literature, for instance, surveying scientists and engineers to get a sense for their views on their social responsibilities. And a key finding there is, yes, there is this belief that I have social responsibility. There's a sense of social responsibility. But having that sense of social responsibility doesn't always translate into consistent behaviors or actions. And I think part of the reason why that is the case is in science, we just don't do a very good job of making incentives that encourage people to think about the downstream implications of the work.
I agree.
The social implications, the social harms, potential social harms of the work that they might be doing.
If anything, we've insulated them from it. We've said, oh, scientists do the science, let the ethicists worry about the downstream effects. Like we've sort of presented science as if it has some sort of pure intentionality around it. Science for the sake of science, as if it does exist in a social vacuum. And I think that's the biggest problem with the skeptic movement as a whole, which I'm part of. But I think it's why misogyny runs rampant. I think it's why racism runs rampant. I think because we've sort of given a pass to the concept of scientific inquiry as if it somehow exists on a different plane than society.
Yeah, and this is making me remember, one interview that I did with a scientist that, I really appreciated because they were saying, yeah, I think some of my colleagues would say that they don't have a responsibility to engage with the public or to think about what might happen to their research once it leaves the lab and gets deployed out into the real world. But who knows our science better than us? Who best positioned to try and communicate to non-academic audiences about what we're doing and why we're doing it? But I also know that, in other conversations and interviews that I've done with scientists, there's not a lot of reward for doing that kind of work. The things that get rewards are writing grants, are getting papers published. They're not going on a podcast. They're not trying to talk to the public and write an op-ed. Those are sometimes even looked down upon.
Sometimes they're punished for that. Like sometimes they get in trouble with their departments.
Right.
Yeah. It's a tough landscape to try to navigate. And I'm not saying obviously the responsibility is fully on the scientists at all. It's a social change that the cool thing is I do think that even against the backdrop of the current administration, just kind of fresh blood within academia, I think is starting to recognize there are more and more people like you doing the work that you do and sort of being that voice. I guess historically that's what academic institutions were always supposed to be about. But there does seem to be this sort of, I don't know, thing that happens over time where once you're in an institution, you just start to play the game the way the institution has been playing it for so long. So it's always exciting to me when I see young academics coming in and sort of like rabble rousing. I'm curious about, though, sort of we're coming towards the end of the hour. And the one thing we haven't really gotten deep into is what exactly sort of genomic tools are. Like we've mentioned in passing that people are going to continue to do the research that they're doing, or they're going to continue to use big data to innovate or to develop technologies, but we haven't really talked about that in any sort of concrete way. Like, what is a good example of genomic research that is actively looking at applications that could affect people's lives?
Yeah, so Sam and I focus on 3 particular applications of genomic data. And in particular, we were focusing on 3 potential applications of polygenic scores. So maybe I should just take a second to briefly describe what that is. So when the Human Genome Project was completed in 2003, many members of the scientific community thought that it was going to usher in this really transformational understanding of human health and human behavior. And we were going to find a bunch of genes for X. And really what we came to realize was, there's no single gene for heart disease or for type 2 diabetes. These are traits that are complex or polygenic in nature, meaning that there are hundreds, if not thousands, of different locations on the genome that are each statistically associated with the trait of interest and contribute a small amount towards predicting or trying to predict that trait. And polygenic scores are an aggregate of those very small effect sizes from those very many variants that are across the genome. Polygenic scores are a relatively new tool. They're an emerging tool, but we're seeing them appear on the direct-to-consumer genetic testing marketplace, for example, companies selling genetic tests for things like political views, intelligence, math ability, reading ability. At one point, there was even a company that put out a genetic test that they called 50 Shades of Gay, or How Gay Are You, that was claiming to take your DNA and analyze it for your genetic propensity for same-sex sexual behavior. And these companies are offering these services with very little transparency in terms of what data they're drawing upon, how predictive, or more accurately, how unpredictive the information that they're providing to consumers is. So the direct-to-consumer genetic testing marketplace is one domain where we look at applications of polygenic scores. Another, and this is going to be one of the latest applications, and which is generating a lot of media attention and conversation, is the use of polygenic scores in embryo selection. So there are a growing number of companies that are offering prospective parents the service of learning their embryos' polygenic scores for traits like heart disease and type 2 diabetes, but also a couple of the companies at least are offering information on things like intelligence, which has generated a lot of controversy for reasons that we've kind of already disclosed and talked about today. So that's another application. And then the third application we talk through is one that we don't yet have examples of it existing or being, rolled out into the real world, but which could conceivably become a use case for polygenic scores, in which some researchers are advocating for or feel should be a use case. So I mentioned that there was a book that I stumbled upon at the library in Cambridge when I was doing my PhD that was called G is for Genes. And one of the messages from that book is this argument that genetics matter and that we should use genetic information from students to try and identify their strengths and weaknesses and develop individualized education plans for students using their DNA. So a kind of analog to precision medicine. And that book was published in 2013, so over a decade ago. And we don't have examples of actual precision education systems in place, at least not yet. But we talk about those kinds of scenarios where people might want to try and use polygenic scores in setting up programs like education systems, or because of the wide array of polygenic scores that researchers have generated, it's also not inconceivable that a financial lending institution might want to somehow use a person's polygenic score for something like risk-taking behavior to decide whether or not they, want to give them the loan that they're asking for. So we talk about these various kinds of applications of polygenic scores, and we also talk about how unregulated they are in a context like the United States. So, in the United States, we have GINA, the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, which was passed in 2008. And that protects against genetic discrimination in health insurance and in the workplace. But there are a lot of other potential settings that do not have the same levels of protection from genetic discrimination, where we could see polygenic scores getting applied, like education systems, or, as I mentioned, financial lending. GINA also doesn't protect against genetic discrimination in things like life insurance. So there are these various applications. They are highly unregulated. It's a bit of a Wild West, especially if we think about something like embryo selection. It's not a coincidence that the leading companies offering this service are based in the United States. It's because we don't have very many rules when it comes to the technology, whereas other jurisdictions, countries like the United Kingdom, Germany, France, they do not allow the use of polygenic scores in embryo selection. So, I think it's not just these different applications that we're kind of introducing and talking through, what is the science or lack thereof behind them, but also what is the lack of regulation around them. And if we continue to allow them to run free without any kind of regulatory oversight, what does our future look like? And I think both Sam and I are concerned that, especially on the embryo selection front, that not putting in any kind of regulatory oversight, in the short term, because the science isn't strong, people are spending their money and making decisions based on what is essentially snake oil. But in the long term, if the technology does improve and people are making decisions about what embryo to implant using the polygenic score information, then we run the risk of exacerbating social inequalities in our world, and also potentially encoding those social inequalities into our DNA. If only those who are privileged and wealthy access the technology and use that technology to make embryo selection decisions that they believe are going to result in a healthier, taller, or smarter child.
Yeah, I mean, it's the original promise, and I say that intentionally, of the eugenics movement. I mean, now we have the hindsight when we look back at eugenics and say, ooh, that was, Hitler like followed in the footsteps of these British and American scientists. And this was like wholly just a terrible thing. But when the eugenics movement was gaining traction and popularity, it was seen as good. Like people wanted good, healthy babies. Mm-hmm. And that's really how it was argued, right? Like, let's make decisions so that we are producing babies with better health traits, and that are going to live longer and be smarter, and who could argue with that? So it does. We run the risk, and I guess that's the big question, right? Is that kind of your big takeaway? Is that if we're not thinking about these things now, we're not going to have appropriate regulation against them if and when they do become a reality. So we've got to be thinking about this not as a problem for tomorrow, but a problem that we really need to grapple with and spend time in that gray area today.
Yes, absolutely. I think that it could be very easy, and this was something that Sam and I expressly didn't want to do, to say, hey, the science is bad now, we shouldn't allow it, and kind of end the conversation there. This is on the embryo selection front. We really wanted to challenge ourselves and readers to think about, okay, well, what if we find ourselves in a world where the science isn't bad, where you could actually do this in a robust manner? Then what do we want to happen? So I think that that's kind of the important conversation that we're trying to urge people to have now, before we get to the point where the tech has improved. How do we think about what kinds of traits you would want to make permissible? Or do you want to make the tech allowable or usable if not everyone is going to be able to access it? So those are the kinds of questions and conversations that need to happen now.
So important. And so I'm curious, I guess, last question before we close out. How did you guys go about, or like, what was the hope when you wrote the book for the sort of level of readership? Obviously, you guys are academics. This has been, I'd say a relatively sophisticated conversation that we've had here, but can somebody who doesn't have a degree in this stuff, somebody who didn't study biology in college, will they be able to follow along and to grapple with these really important questions as well?
Yes, we worked really hard to try and make this book accessible to public audiences. And there are, I hope, aspects that are going to really resonate with folks. In that, for instance, one of our chapters, it also tries to help you make sense of results that you might have gotten from a company like 23andMe or Ancestry.com. What are those companies really doing when they're telling you that you are 70%, Northern European ancestry, and why should you maybe take those results with a grain of salt? Or if you see an ad from a direct-to-consumer genetic testing company selling you a genetic test for something like facial attractiveness, what are the kind of limitations that you should have in mind there? So I think a complementary goal of the book is to help the everyday person understand that, understand what the genetic technologies that might show up in their own life mean, and what are important things to consider when, deciding whether or not you want to purchase a DNA kit from Ancestry.com, and what do the results mean for you, and things like that. So we do work hard, and we also ground many of our chapters in stories about real people who have had real experiences with, either genetic technologies or with myths about genes. So we also have this narrative element to it. And then the final thing I'll say is, when Sam and I first started writing this book, we actually originally thought it was going to be called Debating DNA, because we thought that the whole book was going to be us, arguing with each other in this back and forth manner. And instead, we write a book that's largely written in one voice, except for the middle part of the book where we start and end each chapter with this back and forth dialogue between the two of us, where we're having a conversation about our differences and our disagreements. And, that's a conversation between two people that, again, is us trying to make this very complex topic relatable and digestible to people who may not have had any training in genetics or bioethics or biology. So I hope people find this book as one that they can turn to and understand and are learning something from and are enjoying reading it.
Absolutely. And I think with that, I just want to thank you so much, not just for all of the incredible work that you did with your co-author, Sam, but also for taking the time to help us today to understand the complexity and the nuances of these really, really important problems that we do need to grapple with as we move forward as a society. So everybody, the book is What We Inherit: How New Technologies and Old Myths Are Shaping Our Genomic Future by Dr. Daphne O. Martschenko and her co-author, Dr. Sam Trejo. Daphne, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
And everybody listening, thank you for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy.